Summer 2024 Bring Your Own Lunch program. My name is Richard Dover. I'm the summer interpretive tour guide here at Lawrence Heritage. And again, welcome and thank you all for coming today. The month now of August, we will begin winding down the lunch program on Wednesdays. We may continue it after the summer season ends here. We're not sure yet. If we do continue it, we will get the word out to the friends and otherwise, okay? But for the summer season itself, we are now down to the last four of the lunch programs. So today we'll be learning about urban renewal in Lawrence in particular. And then next week I'll be talking about Nixon and Watergate, 50 years after the president's resignation. And then the week after that, we'll be hearing from our former visitor services supervisor, Brett Balmer, on Olmsted, Frederick Law Olmsted in the Merrimack Valley. And then the last Wednesday of August, we'll be hearing from Tom Spitaleri on socialism in the Merrimack Valley. Okay. And again, the program may continue during the fall. I'm not sure right now. But again, if it does, we will try to get the word out. Okay? So, as always, help yourself to the refreshments over there to my left. Okay? And I will now turn the program over to Professor Steve Russell from Northern Essex Community College. Will talk to us about the history of urban renewal and efforts that were done right here in the city of Lawrence. Okay? So,
thanks, Rich, and thanks for inviting me. And it's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here. I think sometimes when we talk about the history of the city of Lawrence, we focus an awful lot on the industrialization and also the big strike in 1912. And I think we forget that Lawrence is part of an overall picture of American history that continues right up till today. You know, and I think that's really important. It's pretty exciting. 1912 is not the end of it. It might just be the beginning. Anybody know what urban renewal is? Anybody want to hazard a guess as to what that is? Yeah, go ahead.
But taking down urban blight, that quotes.
What's blight?
What is blight? The word of it, they considered a post office on Broadway urban blight. They removed the Granite State Post Office and built the golden arches of McDonald's to replace it. So that to me, some historians call it urban destruction.
Destruction, yeah. That's not the intent, of course. It was a very, urban renewal in general is a very well-intended program. Here's a definition here from the Massachusetts General Laws. And while this is a federal program, states were charged with implementing it. And it says here to assist communities to revitalize, okay? Not so much to destroy, but to revitalize. Disinvested and underutilized neighborhoods. But what do you mean by disinvested? Anybody know what that means? Disinvested. We've got a lot of smart young people here, right?
It's not what it means that you're invested in something, but what if you were disinvested?
Not investing.
Yeah, you're not investing. And for many years, there had been very little investment, not just in Lawrence, but in a lot of American cities, okay, especially the medium-sized ones that tended not to attract an awful lot of capital. Now, very little investment in their industrial base, which of course is really important because that's what provides the jobs for people, and that's what provides the tax revenue for the city. Okay, and both of those are very important. It also talks about, here's what they wanted to do to redevelop it for commercial, industrial, business, governmental uses, possibly they could take land, okay, claim people's property by way of eminent domain. Anybody ever heard of that particular term before? Very controversial, okay? Often we think of eminent domain as land being taken for a public purpose, for example, like a highway, okay, or maybe a park. But here we see land being taken for private use, for private developers to go in and redevelop this property, okay? And this part was very controversial, but time and time again, courts ruled that this was okay, because ultimately, the private development would result in a better community, in a healthier community, in a more vibrant community, okay? So that was the goal, okay? And as Tom mentioned before, sometimes we talked about urban destruction, okay? And that was necessary in order to remove the blighted areas. What they, for residential, they would sometimes refer to it as slum clearance. So this really gets going in a very big way with the Federal Housing Act of 1949. And the federal government started to pump a lot of money into this. Previously, it had been mostly state and local governments that did this, but at this point, the federal government was becoming more and more used to taking on big projects and getting involved in local affairs. And this started somewhat with the New Deal, with the attempts to address the problems of the Great Depression. And you had a Housing Act in 1937. But World War II interrupted all of that. And one thing to remember is that by the time you get done with World War II, in, say, 1945, and then by the time society gets back on more of a civilian footing, it takes about until 1946 or 47. Very little had been built or modernized in the United States since the late 1920s. Okay? So you have almost 20 years where there hadn't been much building, there hadn't been much investment, okay, in industrial, in modernization of factories. There were new ones being built, and then were geared for the war effort, but not very much had been done to modernize industries like textiles, shoes, and so forth, which were heavily concentrated in the Merrimack Valley. You also had very little done to the housing stock. Okay. Not much had been built or renovated even since the late 1920s. Okay. During the Great Depression, there was no money for that. During World War II, there was plenty of money, but the government diverted all of the resources that would ordinarily go into the construction industry. They diverted that into the war effort. Okay. The economy was not really capable of addressing both the military and the civilian uses at the same time. So here we are, 1945, 1946, 47, and the government, President Truman, are saying, look at it. There's a lot of light, and you can see some of it in the posters here. And this is not just in Lawrence, this is throughout the country. Okay. You see it in this neighborhood right here. You know, industrial properties that weren't really being used to capacity. So the answer was, and also housing. Okay. There's a lot of housing where people were very crowded together. And this had always been true in Lawrence and in a lot of other cities throughout the country. People were very crowded together. Plumbing, electricity, and all of these kinds of things were not really up to modern standards. And in some ways they were health hazards, they were fire hazards, and not really great places to live. But, people said, let's straighten this out, because the government, this is a time when you had tremendous faith in government. Today, we may not think that way as much as we used to. Okay? But in the late 1940s, most Americans believed that government could do wonderful things. They fought 2 world wars. They, addressed the worst problems of the Great Depression, and they were keeping communism at bay. And you started to see an economy that was really bursting at the seams after World War II. And a lot of that was due to government intervention, the GI Bill and so forth. So it seemed like this was a possible task. But it involved moving people around, moving businesses around, and changing the face of cities. So we talked, a little bit about how Lawrence itself gets blighted, okay? Beginning in the if you looked at the late 19th and early 20th century, Lawrence was cutting edge in terms of the textile industry. This was the most modern, up-to-date textile plants, probably in the world. But after World War I, Lawrence began to lose its edge. And again, there wasn't a whole lot of investment in modernization. If you were going to modernize a textile production operation, what would be some of the problems that you might have with some of these buildings? They're beautiful buildings. They served that industry very well in the late 19th and 20th century. But if you want to modernize,
A lot of buildings are geared towards a specific purpose, so it's really difficult. It's a lot of creativity and planning to use them for something that other than what they were originally built for.
that's for sure. That's for sure. You kind of have to have the same needs as you did in, say, 1890, but maybe you didn't have those needs in 1920. These buildings were also built to use belts and have your power source in the lower level of the building and move that power to the top of the building. So multi-story was a very effective way to produce just about anything in manufacturing, and particularly textiles. If you wanted to modernize in, say, 1920, what you wanted to do is to spread out. Okay, you wanted everything on one floor, so you didn't need elevators and cranes and all that stuff. You just moved things from one station to another, and that was a more practical way. So maybe it didn't make, if you had a textile operation, like, say, American Woolen, maybe it didn't make a whole lot of sense to invest too much in some of these old buildings. Maybe it made more sense to move to a place where you could build something completely new. That would be in the American South, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, places like that. We're attracting textile industry from all of the towns here in the Northeast. Also, taxes were much lower. Labor costs were much lower. We had some rather successful labor actions here in the Northeast, including the 1912 strike. And you had much more regulation by individual states of labor maximum hours and things like that. But the mill owners really weren't interested in that. They were much more interested in maximizing their profits, and they could do quite well if they moved their operations to the south. And this is, of course, way before we talk about moving operations overseas, which is, of course, is a big problem getting in the latter quarter of the 20th century. So they didn't really pursue modernization. And when you don't invest in modernization, you're not that competitive. And, you'll run an industry as long as you can. You'll run a factory as long as you can, as long as you're making a profit. But at some point, you're not able to keep up with your competition. You sell it. Okay? You sell the machinery, you move to something else. And what Lawrence and other cities in the Northeast were able to do was to attract other marginal industries. And I say marginal because they're probably not going to last here that long. They're not going to pay wonderful wages. And this would have been shoes and the garment industries in particular. Okay? So instead of making the cloth, what they're doing is stitching together the cloth and making garments and so forth. Lawrence and other cities in the Northeast get kind of a boost in World War II from government contracts. So this allows them, to kind of puts them on life support for a little while longer. But when the war ended, the companies who were left here were very interested in pulling up, quite frankly. So in 1949, sorry, 1952, Francis White, head of America's largest manufacturer of woolen and worsted fabrics, American Woolen Company. That's the company with the clock tower. He was addressing the Lawrence Chamber of Commerce annual dinner, and American Woolen at the time owned 22 mills in New England, and they had paid $200,000 in taxes to the city of Lawrence the year before, and paid over $21 million in wages and benefits to 20,000 workers in the greater Lawrence area. Okay, so that's, in 1952. But what he said was, I'm leaving. I'm getting out of here. And the reason for that is because I can move my operations to the south, and instead of paying $2.3 million in taxes, including all of the plants in Massachusetts, he's only going to be paying $861,000 in taxes. So that's pretty attractive. And a number of places shut down. So finally in 1957, the Pacific Mill closed, marking the end of the textile era. So even by 1953, Lawrence had lost a total of 18,000 textile jobs. So that's pretty serious. And again, some of these other industries can take up the slack, but they didn't pay as much. And they're, how shall I say that? The employment, their employment wasn't steady. Some of these places would set up and shut down after a while. And they were living on borrowed time too, because eventually by the 1970s, you start to see the dropping of tariffs. The taxes that are placed on imported goods. And this was part of an effort that had started right after World War II, or even before World War II was over. The countries of the world got together and said, maybe we ought to encourage free trade, because maybe if we traded with each other, we wouldn't go to war with each other as much. And it took a while for all of those tariff reductions to kick in, but by the 1970s, garments and shoes were basically coming into this country basically tariff-free. And of course, that shut down more of those marginal industries that I was talking about. So we're kind of fighting a battle here against, economic forces that are certainly beyond the control of what's happening in this city. However, the region as a whole is quite prosperous. Massachusetts, by the time we get into the 1960s or so, has a lot going for it. It's got a lot of government contracts, defense contracts. Places like Raytheon, they're booming. But where are they building their plants? Suburbs. Yeah, not far away. Andover, place like Western Electric, did have a plant here in the city of Lawrence for a while, but then they decided, let's move to North Andover, where we have this huge, sprawling complex, which is, I think they call it Osgood Landing now, and had several iterations after that. But there you can expand to your heart's content. Taxes are lower. And this is great for the town of Andover and North Andover, right? They're gaining all that tax revenue. Where Lawrence, with its larger population, just doesn't have that space to expand. okay? One of the difficulties that Lawrence has, and that's in some ways unique among its sister textile cities, is that it is geographically very small. It's 7 square miles. Lowell is about 13 square miles. And Manchester is 33. And they have roughly, well, the same populations. Lawrence is a little bit less. I have a table here. Let me see. Look at that, I didn't make it. No, too bad. Oh, you said it.
Were Lowell and Manchester, as they were being developed during the industrialization of those areas, were they as planned by the textile companies themselves as Lawrence was?
Certainly Manchester was. Lowell, a little bit less so, because Lowell had a number of different industries, and again, it was the first one. So they actually didn't know what they were doing.
A little experimental.
A little bit more experimental. Lawrence comes after that. It learns a lot from Lowell. Okay, so they're able to do a lot more planning, and you can see the buildings are much more massive. And, you know, this was really sophisticated. Manchester was basically one company, MSK, and it was very, very much planned, and MSK was certainly the largest producer of textiles. Here's the data I was looking for. So this is in 2020. So Lawrence today has got about 12,714 people per square mile. Lowell, 8,500 roughly, in Manchester, 3,500. And you go to Manchester, you can see this is wide open spaces. So both cities went through the same issues with deindustrialization, this exchange of companies, but whereas Manchester and Lowell, especially Manchester, but also Lowell, they had some places within their cities where they could relocate industries and people. Lawrence didn't have that room. Okay. Lawrence retained most of it. You know, there was a dip in population in the 70s and 80s, but it kind of sprung back in the 90s and 2000s. Whereas the other two cities had a kind of a steady increase to the point where they're both 150,000. So, in any case, first thing you got to do is you got to remove, when you're urban renewal, is you've got to remove, and that's where the urban destruction comes. And the plan was that we would be replacing all of this housing and all of these commercial properties and these industrial properties that were destroyed. And they didn't really use that term because they were very hopeful. They said, you know, in some ways, the urban renewal program was kind of a gentrification fantasy. Okay? The idea was that we would be replacing this so-called blighted housing or these slums with housing that middle-class people would want to move into, you know, and that, you know, they wouldn't then move to the suburbs, or we would have nice stores, kind of like what you might find in Andover Center or places like that. And that was going to be what these cities would look like, Lawrence included. Okay? But that's not really the way it worked out. It's much more difficult than that. And so, let's build something new. And yes, and they did. You have a new police station. And there was a lot of emphasis on building civic, but as Tom mentioned before, they tore down some too, like the beautiful post office, for example, on Broadway. So there was a lot of destruction for reasons that now look pretty frivolous, because you can restore those old buildings. So Lowell did, Manchester that is important to remember here is that it was private developers who were in the driver's seat on a lot of this. The idea was, yes, to renovate the community, to make it better for everybody, but private developers were certainly driving the agenda. So short-term gains were something that they thought a lot about. They might not be thinking about how we could make this look 20 years down the line. And again, there was not a lot of imagination, you know, and a lot was learned from the urban renewal experience, that's for sure. By the time we get to 1980, there's a lot different thinking. And then you see it in restoration work that's done all over this city and other cities as well. So the other new thing there, I think that's Wendy's, which is down there on Common Street. It kind of looks like a Wendy's that you might find in a suburb where you have an awful lot of, car traffic. And when we're getting into the 1950s, 60s, it became apparent that cities need to be redesigned in order to accommodate the automobile. All right. Public transit systems, that's another example of disinvestment. They were simply very little investment in public transportation systems, rail or bus for that matter. And the cities were really in many ways designed, especially the retail sector, was designed not so much for people coming in on automobiles, but for people coming in on buses or on foot. Okay? And you see in these pictures, and one of the things maybe folks don't know about it, the Lawrence History Center has a beautiful collection of photos of all of the buildings that were taken down. Somebody had the foresight to photograph these buildings just as they were coming down, and you can go look at them at the Lawrence History Center. It's quite amazing, really. I don't think there are too many cities that have quite that kind of collection. But you see here, you have a mix of residential and commercial, and there were small stores all over the place, and most of the buildings were kind of owner-occupied also, where you would maybe rent out 2 top floors, live on 1 floor. But there was, again, not an awful lot of money available in these families to reinvest. Okay? That's because people lost jobs, and so that's part of that whole disinvestment pattern that leads to what we would call blight. So again, what the new way of thinking about what cities should look like was that commercial and residential should be quite separate. Okay, that's kind of a suburban model. That might work okay for Andover, but it was something that really took away, it sucked the life out of many of the cities. In some ways, Lawrence fared urban renewal better than many cities. It didn't have to have a highway cut through the middle of it. If you drive through Worcester on Route 290, you see how that highway just makes a slash through the city. And it really devastated it. And there's finally they're doing things to make it come back. Some cities are taking down their elevated highways and putting them in grade level. Or a few cities are burying them like Boston. That's a pretty expensive proposition. But the whole idea is a recognition today that those kinds of projects did a whole lot to divide cities. Now, some might say that is intentional. Because was that intentional to divide, to move poor people, to move racial minorities out of the city? I mean, that's something that a lot of historians talk about, and that what city planners today try to rectify. Okay? But that's a very difficult issue to work with. Another way of addressing all those people that you remove out of those houses, the so-called blighted houses, the housing that we see here, was you create public housing projects. Okay, and that's what they call them, the projects. And many of them are quite large. Lawrence's are not huge compared to some of the other cities, like in New York, St. Louis, Boston, and so forth. You know, you have several skyscraper-type buildings. And yes, these are communities, but the problem is that they're not organic. They're not neighborhoods in the sense that people come to them, voluntarily and so forth. They're kind of put there. Public housing projects originally were established to house working-class people, okay? The kind of people that you might see in there, okay? And you move them to places like this, which were considered more modern. You know, they had supposedly good plumbing and electricity and all that sort of thing, fire protection. But of course, you didn't have ownership either. And when you don't have a pathway to ownership, what can happen is that these places fall into disrepair. You also didn't have investment in them. Cities, fine, they built them and they say, this is great, but was there proper maintenance? And often that fell by the wayside, as with so many public projects. So, urban renewal presents with a lot of dilemmas. Again, why not attract modern industry to the city? Well, there are some answers. It's an industrial park in South Lawrence, but it's kind of small. And here you see an aerial view of the Riverwalk, which comes into its own in the 2000s. It's not really set up for modern manufacturing, but it's fine for service types of businesses that are there, restaurants and so forth. But it took a lot of time before you could engineer projects like this. But the big stuff in the tax revenue went to the suburbs. And yes, they employed people from Lawrence, but most of the time, the people who worked there, who earned very good wages, chose to live elsewhere, chose to live in the suburbs themselves. Okay? So we got a lot of things working against the city. Even a homegrown company like Inc. Here they are in Lowell, huge structures there. And the one on the right is Tucket Boulevard plant, which was a huge place where they could spread out. They were on 2 floors there, and ideal for modern manufacturing. The other thing that kind of works in tandem with urban renewal, another federal program, is the interstate highway system, okay, which, seemed like a good thing. Moves people around, moves cars around much faster, but it also involved a lot of destruction of property, some in the city of Lawrence. It also undermined public transport, okay, which was feeding people into the center cities. Retail also established itself near the highways because people could get to the, stores much more easily. They didn't have to worry so much about parking. But it does accelerate suburbanization, and it accelerates white flight, meaning the movement of people, particularly white people, traditional ethnic groups, out of the center cities and into the suburbs, and kind of left the cities more for people of color. So cities kind of responded by adjusting their traffic patterns, one-way streets and so forth, and building big parking garages. And of course, you can see that those one-way streets, this is Amesbury Street, I believe, it's got 3 lanes, but, it's not really all that busy. And the parking garage, well, it looks better now. This picture was taken before some renovation, but it does look better today. But it never really was filled up, okay, because there was really no reason for people to come into the city. So what, again, city planners were trying to do with urban renewal was to put the suburbs into the city. And that really was not a formula that was working very well. Retail. On the left, you see a picture of Essex Street. It was like about 1960 or so. You know, pretty filled up with people. Hard to find a parking place, and people complained about those kinds of things. Okay, you know, but even though having it hard to find a parking place is a success story, you don't see that with that picture of Wendy's that I showed you. But as time goes on, you see the retail sector moving out. Here's the second picture is the loop in Methuen, and this is more its current configuration. That's not what it looked like when it was built in the 70s. And the other one is the mall at Rockingham in Salem. But you know, there was really no reason for the retail sector to stay in the city itself. It really was not set up for it, okay, because the automobile was critical to the move. So more and more you see a city as a result of urban renewal, or at least urban renewal is not able to do anything about it, a city that is increasingly poor. And when a city is poor, services are increasingly in demand. Okay? Education costs more, everything costs more, and at that time the state did not take care of as much of the assistance programs as it does today. So the tax revenue from the new building, such as it was, did not make up for the older properties. Okay, so that's one of the big problems that city officials had to deal with, because they've always got to think about tax revenue. And also you have an awful lot of people left out. Okay? And you start to see an influx of people from the Caribbean, from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and they find that the city is not hospitable to them. The city is not providing the same economic opportunities for them. And you see all of this blowing up on August 8th through 10th, 1984, which is exactly, what, 40 years ago this week. Okay, and we'll call the riots, where luckily no one was killed, but several people were injured. And it caused a rethinking. Were we going in the right direction? Okay, because it was a shock. People did not expect this to happen. That happened in New York or in all kinds of other places, Detroit. But what's going on? What is it that we should be doing? And maybe we should regionalize. That's one answer. But in Massachusetts, each municipality is quite separate. Regionalization is very difficult, and municipal boundaries are such solid lines. And you can tell the difference when you cross over into Andover or North Andover, that you're in a different place entirely. Housing is different, education is different, racial composition is quite different, and the economies are different too. So, beginning in the late 80s and into the 90s and up to today, Lawrence, what is it going to look like? Okay, it's not going to look like what the planners of the 1960s and 1950s envisioned. It's not going to be another suburb type flavor. So again, the state took considerable responsibility in, say, funding education and so forth, even taking over the schools at times. You have a development of strong community-based institutions, okay? And you see the local people really taking things in many ways into their own hands. So it won't look like it did in 1950. But it has some, Lawrence has got a lot going for it, especially if you compare it to other cities who have an industrial past, who went through urban renewal, and especially those in the Midwest. I've had a couple of occasions to drive through or take the train through so forth, and you see a lot of empty cities. The thing about Lawrence is it's not empty. Okay? And all the masses of people that we have here is really a good thing. What is very interesting here is that the population, and you can barely see those dates on the left here, 1970s, about the 1980s, the low point, 63,000 people. But now we're up to 89,000, which people want to live here. Okay? And maybe it's not for reasons that we find, maybe it's because it's better than a lot of other places. Lawrence has the advantage of being in the metropolitan area, okay, which helps a lot. Cities that are more isolated aren't in such a position. It's also become much more hospitable to people from the Caribbean, especially the Dominican Republic. Okay, it's kind of saying, this is a city, this is kind of a magnet, and that's a good thing, because you can feel at home here. And that has always been that way. But since 2000s especially, you see community groups taking charge and saying, this is how we want to mold this city so that it can be a place that's hospitable to all. And that's a great advantage. So urban renewal is a great experiment. And it's not just here, but it's all over the country. And it seldom turns out the way that the planners of the 1950s and the 1960s envisioned. Did it do some good? Probably, in some cases. But maybe it moved too fast. Maybe it didn't consult people who it was necessary. It was very top-down. And certainly in terms of the physical stuff, much more attention is now paid to rehabilitation. Before you tear something down, think about, is it possible to rehab, to reuse it, and not disrupt the community as much. So that's about all I have for this afternoon. Questions, discussion? Yes.
You use the term and sugarcoating it, calling it gentrification fantasy. Let's call it spade a spade. It was big government overreach, demanding by its rules and regulations, and not by the populace, for the people who knew what was going in their own urban areas. It was basically social experimentalism, just like Marxism and Leninism was. We're going to come in, we're going to tell everyone what to do. Very, very good example of it. We had a beautiful police established centers of tourism, small business, entrepreneurs, and everything else, and you look at the area like in April behind between Linwood Cemetery and the library, and you look at it, it's just ugly concrete, so it pans out at the end. All of this experimentalism just is, like I said, government overreach.
Yeah. Well, if you look back to the 1950s, people had a lot of faith in government. As I mentioned earlier on, government had pulled the country at least out of the worst parts of the Depression, won 2 world wars. So why couldn't it straighten out the cities? Very top-down approaches, because that's what worked when fighting a war. And, the country was very much still in that military mindset. If you just march forward, you can do it. We've learned since then, of course, that that's not possible, partly due to failures even of military efforts. So it's a different mindset. There's no question about it, but people kind of accepted it. Except those people who were in the pathway of urban, some of this urban development. But if you weren't in the pathways, you look like and say, well, they're removing those buildings. That's kind of a good thing. We learned later that no, it isn't. And the materials and the regulation was very, it's very top down. But people were used to that. They're willing to accept it. Today, there's a whole different mindset. We've learned from these kinds of mistakes that, yes, government overreach can be a problem, that local people have to really be, that they have to be consulted. You got to think about what each place is like. And you're right about those places that escaped urban renewal, like Newburyport and so forth, and Portsmouth. Portsmouth is very interesting in that the publics, they had big plans for tearing down what is today the area called Strawberry Bank. But the local community stepped in and they said, wait a minute, we're not going to go along with this. So if you have a community that's really in tune with things, they can stop it. And even in Lowell, they wanted to extend the Lowell connector all the way into the city. And people said, no, we're going to stop it here. And you can see it stops in a very awkward place, but it didn't take down any more homes. Actually, they did clear out some homes. But, or the Southwest Corridor in Boston, that's another one, where they planned to build a highway, and eventually people stopped it. And that's part of the 1970s. Is you see a lot of communities putting the brakes on these efforts and saying, let's rethink this. Maybe there's another way. Yeah, you have a question.
I just was curious as what your thoughts on this were. You put the population of Lawrence about 89,000.
Yeah.
And the last figure that I saw was a couple of years back. There was 11,000 public school students.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's 11,000 public school students, you got a population of 89,000. I think that number is exceedingly low. I think your population here, and I'm a tourist, but I think your population here, I grew up here, but I'm a tourist now. I think your population here is probably around 180. You just don't know who's here.
I think it's probably higher than the 89. 180 might be a bit much, but maybe into 100. I don't know, but there's no way of knowing.
Basing on just ratio proportion, with 11,000 public school students, 89,000 population, that makes like 1 out of every 8 people a public school student in Lawrence. Yeah, and that's why I think the population is somewhere in the mid-hundreds.
Mid-hundreds, that's sometimes though for the census, when the census is taken, some people say, you know, I really don't want to be counted because maybe their immigration status is ambiguous. And even if it is, they just said, I want to stay away from government because who knows what they're going to do with it. They find out. And as far as the school system, 11,000, you also have a rather vibrant private school component to education, charter schools and a number of Catholic schools, which probably add to that. So you're,
Yeah, I think that number, I just, I've always said, I don't think we know who's here.
well, no, that is probably true. That is probably true. Yeah. I think that's true, a lot of things. Let's see, Tom, for the
Yeah, they also tried that in Hayward. They wanted to connect I-95 with 495. When they wiped out Ginty and Bailey Boulevard, built Ginty and Bailey Boulevard, took out all the first period homes, and then the wealthy people in Riverside and the other side said, we're taking you to court and stop the whole project.
right, yes. Yes, it's a lot easier to take down buildings in a poor neighborhood because people that don't have somebody else had a question back there, yeah. Sorry.
You think Lawrence is, what was your question?
Do you believe Lawrence is getting gentrified right now?
I don't think so. I think the housing stock that's being built is, if you look at it in the grand scheme of things, it's still kind of affordable compared to other places. I don't think so. I don't know. What do you think?
I'm coming from the base.
Yeah, why do you think that?
Like all the development of the mills,
Yeah.
I know there's a sign of gentrification where big businesses will show up. Well, it's not like a big business, I guess. Like Chase Bank just opened up on Essex Street.
Okay.
And I remember my mom telling me, like, this, I don't know. I don't feel like it's going to gentrified.
If that happens, where do poor people go?
I'll go to Syria.
Where do you have that?
You said there was about conflict with the
Which conflict was this?
It was like the one from August.
Oh, August 84. Well, there were a couple of, and I didn't prepare too well for this part. That deserves a whole other talk in itself. Rich.
Yeah, that's true.
We put it on the calendar. So there were people from the Caribbean, from the Dominican Republic, the Puerto Rico, were starting to come in, and they found discrimination. They found that they were being excluded from employment, that some businesses didn't want to even serve them. And so this simmering kind of, it takes only an incident, and I can't recall exactly what the incident was. It had very little to do with the bigger picture, but it gets people angry. And they say, we're not being welcomed into this community, and we're part of this community. We're providing, we're the ones who are, keeping the population what it is. We're doing the hard work here. We need to have a voice. And the way the structure of city government was set up too, it excluded. Okay, you didn't have district representation as you do today, and that came about. The city government did not have the diversity that represented the city, and people who were, at the bottom of the economic ladder were very frustrated.
I haven't been book about it, if you're interested in more.
Yeah.
It's a really crazy, like you said.
You had your hand up for quite a while. I'll come back to you.
I want to answer the young gentleman's about gentrification.
Oh, yeah.
I grew up on the same corner that I've lived all my life. And when I was a child, there was doctors, 3 of them in my neighborhood, 4 dentists in my lights.
Yeah.
I've seen the drastic, it does gentrification. And one understatement with the overthese supposedly upper class moving into the city. I had people at zoning that said that they didn't want urbanization of the city because we would bring, and this is a quote, too many of those people in.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what is those people? Those people are white educated. That's what they didn't want in the city. You know, and I'm saying to myself, it doesn't make sense. You need your middle class. And they went against the idea of bringing in doctors, attorneys, and everything else.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the structures of so many of these professions have changed so much, not just here in Lawrence, but globally. It would be hard. One of the downsides of urban renewal and of city planning in general is that you're sometimes trying to envision a community based on what you know or what has been in the past. And you can't really do that because everything changes all the time. Things change very rapidly today. And so it's awfully hard to replicate. But you're pointing to a more integrated kind of community, at least in terms of economic status. More, you know, you have poor people living near to people who are better off, college educated, living next to others.
The Trust Bank, the largest bank in the Merrimack Valley.
Yeah.
The Murphys and their cousins all lived in Lawrence, right up on Tower Hill.
Yeah.
And they voted, so,
Yeah.
you know.
But those industries have changed. Banking has changed all over the country, too. You had a question here.
Yeah, I was wondering if you lived in Lawrence during the 1984 riots.
I did not, no. And I don't today. I work in northern Essex, so I become familiar with the city and because of working here. But I live quite a ways away from Dartmouth. Yeah. But I did work nearby here in those days. And not an awful lot it wasn't really talked about too much. It's a story that needs to be investigated and told. And the 40th anniversary would be a good time to start, probably. Okay, who else? Somebody else had a question. I saw a hand up here. Yes? I thought yes.
On the same subject of gentrification, it's become very fashionable, whether it's Sal Napoli, or Bob Hanson, to buy the old mill properties and turn them into very high-priced condos with rooftop gardens and tennis courts. And I think you're absolutely right that there's that type of development, as good as it is, drives up the real estate costs in the city in general. So, for example, on my modest street across the river here, there was a house went for $52,000. That was during the foreclosure crisis, and now it's worth $500,000. You know, and that's just 12 years, something like that.
Yeah.
A real estate investment company called Berkeley Investments came to Lawrence 2 years ago and bought 5 properties in Lawrence. They haven't specified what kind of development. They paid $99 million for them. Yeah, but so that kind of thing. In other words, we're talking about gentrification that's region-wide. People in Boston, in fact, now reverse commute via commuter rail and live in the Washington Mills and all of these rich condos, but their jobs are in Boston. People used to commute from Lawrence to Boston to work. Now it's the opposite. They're coming out here to avoid the high rents in there. So that trend is there. But one interesting thing about that Berkeley investment thing is, the last I heard anyway, that there was no in most cases, a city will jump in and say, make it 20% affordable units, take care of the neighborhoods. They made that purchase without any commitment like that.
Yeah.
So it's,
I mean, it's a difficult issue. And the idea of people commuting to jobs in Boston and living out here, if Governor Healy were to walk in the room right now, she'd say, that's great. That's exactly what we want to do. Why we want to build up commuter rail. And then they're doing this, they're trying to do the same thing in Fall River and New Bedford right now. And so you have, on the one hand, you say, well, look at these places across the street here. I don't know what they're going for, but they're probably pretty much up there. You know?
I was thinking about, like, it is regional. And I think it is because we don't have a highway cutting through our city, but we have a river.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important that the first purpose of the city was an industrial city.
Yeah.
And thinking about how Renewal looks like, the center where Commerce Street is, where Essex Street is, that's where it's getting the most focus right now. But as you go to the outskirts of Lawrence, that's where you see the old versions of Renewal is still lasting.
I see.
So I was wondering if it's true that, so me and our kids talk about how closer to Methuen versus closer to Andover, the architecture looks different.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see it. Is it just different architects, or is it because of how it started? Like those houses are still in the 1920s. Like we're talking about Veterans Memorial Stadium projects, like the Mount Vernon projects.
Yeah.
Those all have a different look to it versus like closer to the Loop or closer to.
I think that maybe the styles vary depending on how much property you've got to build on. You can spread out a little bit more in Andover, North Andover, because they also had, I think they have higher minimum lot sizes. Some maybe, I'm not sure what they are, maybe quarter acre, eighth of an acre or something, whereas in the city here, it's the zoning regulations are geared toward density. Some of that might be changing.
I just want to answer this question. Those particular projects were built after World War II for the veterans. Those were, they had clock, Essex, those, because and when the veterans came back, there was no housing and the shortage, and so the federal government put a lot of money in to do small family, first-time buyers, and that's who lived there were all World War II veterans with their families, because they were all double living with their parents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think Tom.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because my great uncle was one of the first people to move into that veterans housing. He was my great aunt. That was strictly built for veterans housing.
And where is this project now?
Right in the stadium, off of 114.
Okay, sure.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
Veterans Memorial, that whole area was built. Same with the Riverside section of Haverhill, near Market Basket, near the Grove Bridge. That was all veterans housing only.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Another thing I was going to mention was we work with like parks and trees. We actually have a cohort here, two cohorts here, groups. One is so green, the other one is so reduced. And so our groups look at like air quality, trees and lines, how it affects the air quality. And I'm not sure how this has been, if you know have any knowledge about it in our renewal history, but like how much removal was focused on trees, how much renewal was focused on trees, especially in areas where there's like heat islands and it's just concrete. Like, did they just forget about trees? Like, you go to places in like Brookline that has very similar architecture downtown.
Yeah.
And you think, why can't that be seen in the outskirts and in the working class projects where people are close to work?
Where you have more affluent people,
Of course.
you have more capability to organize and to resist. I mean, trees are very inconvenient when you really think about it for city planners, for highway people and stuff, you know. because the roots come up and they disrupt everything. And it's expensive to maintain trees, but more affluent neighborhoods can exercise the kind of influence with city government and so forth to say, okay, yeah, it costs a lot, but we'd really like you to keep these trees and to maintain them and to plant new ones. That's one thing. The second thing is people, until maybe the 2000s, we didn't think a whole lot about heat islands and stuff like that. We thought, let's move those cars through as quickly as we can, as conveniently as we can, you know, and we didn't really think about the environmental impacts. Now we do. We think about it a lot, especially with climate change. And hopefully it's not too late, but you see a whole lot of projects. I don't see any around here. Some of the big cities, I think New York City has requirements now that you put rooftops have to have some kind of green in them. I'm not sure if it's New York or some other large city, but there's a lot of work being done in that, and then it's great that you folks are thinking about that. It's going to be your job to help take care of that problem. But you do see cities planting trees, and I'm not sure if Lawrence did it in the downtown areas, just more for aesthetic purposes, I think. But it's hard to get trees that grow well amongst asphalt, and a lot of work has been done in that regard, in my lifetime. But people cut trees down; they get them out of the way. You know, the city I grew up in, Manchester. When my mom was a kid, the main street of Manchester is Elm Street. And the reason it was is because up until the 1930s, they had beautiful elm trees all, up and down the street. And it's a nice wide street too. But there was a disease, the Dutch elm disease came in 1920s, 1930s, and it damaged all those trees. So they cut them down, of course. But they never replanted until maybe the 1980s or so. They put these little trees and something like that. Today they have a few more, but it's hard to do. It's hard to do. And it's expensive. And again, cities where you have mostly poor people, they don't have the kind of clout. They don't have the political clout or after. And it's one of the things that I think Lawrence has made tremendous strides in that. People are less afraid to move forward and say, this is what we want. This is what we need.
If it came to a vote, I'd say let's double the size of your organization and plant a bunch more trees.
Yeah.
Working on it.
It's been a real improvement.
Yeah, I think the groundwork was done about 800 so far this year.
So groundwork is actually planting trees.
Yeah, they have an active tree team. I bet folks downstairs from DCR can tell you a lot about it too. They have an active partnership where they're planting trees in the cities of Lawrence and Haverhill as part of the Greening the Gateway Cities program. So they're trying to reduce urban heat islands, but it's it's back and forth between overseas and absent landlords who are paving things, and then we come in and say, please put a tree there, please. And then,
So how do they react when you say that?
It depends.
Yeah.
Most of them just don't answer the letter, so they're just like, what? Huh? Tree?
They have no clue.
Sorry. Yeah.
Do you think
most of them aren't here. The ones who are here, we've had some really excellent property owners in the area that have been very cooperative and eager to have their property beautified and improved. And there's a lot of energy use benefits to property owners too. Trees help insulate our homes and our businesses. So we're actually collecting a lot of data right now to try and show, look how good it would be if we had a tree here. It would save you so much money. And then using that.
See, I think that's a whole different approach. I don't think that people who cared about trees were very much aware of the cost savings.
Right. it's complicated. A lot of people don't want trees on their property, but we are we're doing public trees and trees on people's houses, all kinds of stuff. So, like I said, it's slow going, but it is happening.
So there's a lot of good stuff going on. Okay. I guess.
I just want to say on a positive note, because sometimes you see a lot of things, but Lawrence will always do well because of some of the major issues. We have 2 major highways that flank us on either side. We have a connector, 213, that you can crisscross going interstate. We have 23 miles in downtown Boston, 21 miles from the beach, 30 miles, 38 miles to the mountains, and we also have planned city, north, south, east, west, and we have a great fashion, and we have an airport that nobody else can claim as the value that we have, and those assets will always work for our benefit, and that's why I think Lawrence will always succeed, and that's why I'm always proud to say I'm a Laurentian.
Good. Yeah. Now, there's a lot going for the city. If people want to live here, I mean, those population data, you say there's even more. So there must be something going on here. Okay. Thank you so much.